With me today, I have Brian Toki, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Brandwatch. Brian has been at Google, Ask.com, and McKinsey before, and today he heads up the operation of Brandwatch.com. Thank you very much for joining this webcast, Brian.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Investing in social media monitoring tools is probably on the agenda for most online marketers these days. What advice do you have to online marketers when building their case internally for social media monitoring, and so that it ensures that it meets real business value?
So it's a good question, and we often find ourselves being asked that by companies which actually social media monitoring isn't appropriate for. So the first thing to look at is social media meaningful for me? And the two cases where I don't think it is are where it's a business-to-business proposition which doesn't have a geek following, where generally the volumes of mentions are very low and you're just not going to see many people talk about it. And the second case where it probably won't affect you is if you're selling something which is very boring. So I don't wish to be mean about toothpaste, but we recently looked at how many mentions there were per week about a toothpaste brand, and there weren't that many. There were kind of a few dozen, and it just doesn't make for the kind of topic people want to talk about on social media. So the first thing, having cleared the first hurdle, which is, do people find your topic, or your brand rather, an exciting one, thing that generates interest and enthusiasm for? If you've done that, then what you've got to do really is make sure you're monitoring how well you're doing in terms of mentions versus competitors, because being told you've got 100 mentions on social media a month or a day or a week is pretty meaningless unless you know how your competitors do. And the second thing that I think you've got to do is track it over time, so you can see how that improves and how it changes with marketing initiatives and so on. And the third thing I think you need to do is to understand it in a bit more detail. And by that, I would strongly recommend anyone who's looking at social media to read 100 mentions. It takes about an hour and a half, and figure out which kind of categories they go into. And these categories, you can often pre-guess half of them. You think, well, they'll talk about my product launch, an advertising thing, customer service. They'll talk about maybe something going on in a different country or whatever. But you'll often be surprised by the other 3 or 4 things they might be talking about. And so by reviewing 100 mentions, you get the chance to see what's going to come up. And then you can set up, at least you can in Brandwatch, not necessarily our competitors, you can set up ways of auto-categorizing that so that they just pull out those mentions over time. You can see how that changes. So that's kind of a combination of competitor comparison over time, and then the understand the detail by looking at individual categories within a brand. And that, I think, gives you an ability to really understand what's going on, and you can start to track that and set, hopefully, metrics against it.
Yeah, so you mentioned share of voice, and you also mentioned mention audience there. So when you have your monitoring tool in place, what's your advice for ensuring that your organization becomes more data driven and actually make use of the insights that we see in this tool?
Yeah, so I mean, we at Brandwatch have been tracking the number of mentions we've got versus our competitors, and we target ourselves to improve, increase the gap with most of them and catch up the one. I think it's one that's got more mentions than us. So we sort of can set ourselves targets, and I think that's a very useful way of doing it. We also set targets for the kind of mentions we have. So we split that up into, we know what categories they come into, and we want to see the balance more towards the positive stuff and the things we're trying to promote than the bits and pieces which are less interesting to us. It is, however, hard to set realistic targets at the moment. So we do say, we'd like to increase the number of mentions by 10%, 20% or whatever over a period of a month. But sometimes we overshoot wildly, and sometimes we really miss the target. And that's because we don't yet have a body of evidence to say what's a realistic target. And I think we're maybe, as an industry, 12 months away from really understanding what a good target is in social media. But I think you can still set them, even if you shouldn't beat yourself up too much for underachieving.
Do you see that mentions in general for brands is something that is having an upgoing trend in terms of numbers of mentions for normal consumer brands? Do people talk more and more about brands online today?
They do. So we definitely see a big an uptick in number of mentions. It's partly driven by Twitter, which about 15 months ago they were reporting 30 million tweets, and now they're reporting 230 million tweets a day. That is. So you can see that even if the proportion is the same, the sheer number is going to increase, and we find ourselves searching we opened up the floodgates and we started looking for more and more searches internationally, and we're getting 20, 30, 40 million sites to search for, or start paths, which is similar sites to search for. So the volume's increasing in general. People are talking more on social media. As for whether the proportion is more guided towards brands or not brands, I haven't done the numbers, so I'd only be able to speculate. Things about the same. People will always talk about things that interest them, and in a world which has got a lot of marketing messages and a lot of kind of things driven by companies, there will be some. There will be some of that, but I don't think you can rely on just the growth to get people talking about your toothpaste or your kind of B2B brand. I think I don't think that's going to happen yet.
Do you think this upgoing trend is technology driven or driven by maybe a new generation?
I think it's technology driven, in that we see the smartphones basically being allowed to post on Facebook or Twitter very easily, or put comments against news articles that you've read online. And when you look at the demographics of who uses Twitter and Facebook, it's not actually a young group. They're kind of pretty demographically spread across the age groups. So I think it's been more technology, and I think the early adopters were the young people, but older generations have caught them up. Yes, so there are two answers to the privacy question. On the one hand, we're only after mentions which have been broadcast, put out there by people who want to publish their views and tell the world about it. And our job, we see it, is to just make that more available to people who are interested in listening. There's a slightly gloomier answer, which is that, of course, our clients want to hear everything that's being said about them on social media, not just what's being broadcast. And our view is that we just can't serve them. So although we're very clear about the privacy, that we won't invade people's privacy when it's private, we just can't or won't. We can't and we won't include it in what we're monitoring. And we get a bit of rough weather from some of our clients for that. But in general, our view is we're just trying to find things which people are broadcasting to the world as their kind of their view of the world. And that's really what the start of blogs and forums was about, wasn't it? It was all about kind of, I want people to know what I think. And Twitter's continued that. But Facebook's actually a slightly different beast, and that's why Facebook is, one of our hardest challenges is to try and find some useful bits out of the large amount of data on Facebook, but so much of it's private that we end up often disappointing. But I think it's just one of the inevitable features of social media. We can't break that taboo. We can't break the privacy sort of guidelines that we've set ourselves.
Where do you see the trend going with social networks? Twitter, one for example, that they see content like a social currency. Is this a way they potentially can monetize their industry in the future? Twitter, for example, has released the Firehose, which costs quite a bit of money. Do you see this happening with Facebook and potentially other social networks in the future?
I don't know how many companies subscribe to the Firehose. Brandwatch does, and it costs us a lot, but not in the grand scheme of Twitter's earnings. So I don't honestly know if they can make enough money out of providing companies like ourselves and our competitors, and indeed there's a few other sectors where they want to buy the information. If that is their main source of revenue or their own ongoing source of revenue, then the valuations they're kind of getting probably aren't justified. And I don't know the right way it's going to be for them to make money. In fact, so they're advertising top tweets and top sort of advertising accounts you can follow, and they're probably getting some revenue from that. But as time goes on, Twitter's growing immensely. I mean, like we heard from the recent Twitter announcement that they've got 230 million tweets per day, and a year and a bit ago, maybe a year and a quarter ago, it was 30 million. So from 30 to 230 is just an immense growth. So I think things like Twitter, they've got this wealth of content which is worth a lot to people. I just don't know how they can make it monetize it. So I don't have a good answer. It's one of those that we pay a lot, but in the grand scheme of what Twitter needs to keep it going and the valuations, I'd be surprised if it's enough. They need to find another revenue model, and the content on there is very good and it links to a lot of great content. Maybe they'll start charging some use for I don't know, it seems hard to make a model where you charge users some sort of small fraction, but they do drive a lot of traffic to web pages and newspapers, online newspapers, and so on. So yeah, so it's a tough one. I wish I had a better answer.
No.
And then for Facebook, they are less, I guess, less concerned with selling data. They're much more concerned with advertising products. So they're going down the Google route of targeting adverts to people's searches for Google, or people's general likes and profile for Facebook. And I think that would be a fine model for them. I mean, I imagine they'll make a lot of money. So I don't expect Facebook to open up their data, because I don't think it's a big enough revenue stream compared with advertising. I expect Twitter will continue to try and get money out of people for getting lots of data, but I don't know if it'll be enough to justify their high valuations. So that's my kind of view. I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but that's what I've got.
Yeah. So following the path of getting data, from my experience when I tried several different social media vendors, Facebook has been especially difficult to monitor, and I understand that there's a difference in the private data and the public data. But even when we look at the public data and we do searches on Facebook, there seems to be a big difference between the data you can see on Facebook and the data you see in typical social media tools.
Yes.
Is there an answer to that, an explanation?
I think the answer is that you find a bit more content through your own network than ours. So when we log in and search on Facebook, we're logging in as Brandwatch, and Brandwatch doesn't have that many friends on Facebook or that many connections. Whereas when you log in, you've got your own network, and you're allowed to see a little bit more because of the network you can see more stuff. So the answer could be to club together a bunch of networks who are prepared to, or a bunch of people prepared to share their own network of friends, and sort of overcome that, because then you can search as if you're yourself or your friends, and get a bigger body of work. But that problem is that we just, as a corporate entity, Brandwatch, and I guess our competitors are the same, don't have that many friends on Facebook, and if they do, they're not focused on the bit you care about, either the games or the auto industry or whatever it is. They just don't have the same connections you do, and therefore see less information.
So variables could be what language setting you have on your profile when you get the data from the API, because I've seen differences in when I do a search, for example, on pizza, and then I change my Facebook language to Norwegian, to Italian, to French, to American English. I see very different results. Could this be something, maybe?
No, you're right. That's another aspect of the personal login. We just log in usually as the language that the query's in, and either English or Norwegian or whatever, but we don't mix them between them and try and get the other data. We're very much one type of language. It's a great idea to kind of increase our Facebook coverage, and we're looking at it. It's being typically hard, and Facebook doesn't make it very easy for us either. They're sort of not particularly keen on sharing their data, so their API is often harder to use than other people's API.
Okay. And another thing I've been looking at is the spectrum of social CRM tools.
Mm-hmm.
I see Brandwatch as a monitoring tool, and then on the other side we have tools like Spreadfast, Hootsuite, CodeTweet, which is more on the publishing side. Now, what I tend to see is like a merge of the monitoring and the publishing coming together. Radiant 6 and Synthesio have their engagement console. I've seen in Brandwatch now that you can post some things to Twitter and to Facebook. Where do you see Brandwatch, and where do you see this industry in the next 2 to 5 years going?
It's a great question, one that we debate a lot in our board meetings. So we did a bit of research on it, actually, and we looked at tweets. When you go to Twitter, you can see who's publishing individual tweets. It will say, published by, or via web, via iPhone app, via CodeTweet, via Hootsuite, etc. And so we looked at 260 companies, about 100 in the UK and about 160 in the US, and we found some fascinating things from it. So first off, we found out that very few people use the same tool if they're paying for it. So if they're paying for a tool, which we know which tools you pay for this sort of thing, they've normally got, out of that 260 sample size, 1, maybe 2, tops 5 of them use the same tool. So there's a very long tail of tools being used. Most people use the web to do social media, or CodeTweet or Hootsuite or Co-tweet, Hootsuite. There's one other that they use.
Sesmic,
TweetDeck.
TweetDeck.
TweetDeck is the free one, so they use free tools. And there's a few equivalents on Facebook. I can only do it for this analysis. Only works for Twitter because I can see what tool they use to publish it. And those were responsible for sort of 80% of the content. Now, Hootsuite are the only ones that have offered a really expensive upgrade. You can upgrade for a few dollars to a slightly bigger account, and you can upgrade for $1,500 a month to their top account. So they're clearly trying to move in from that direction, and then moving in from the social media monitoring tools like ourselves. You've got Radiant 6 and Synthesio, and we focus more on research so far, but as you say, we're kind of catching up there with our own way of publishing content quite quickly. So it's sort of interesting that there's a lot of people moving into this area. You know, the likes of Hootsuite offering these expensive upgrades, Co-tweet offer an upgrade now, but it's not very expensive yet, and us moving in. And at the same time, there's some programs who are, you know, CRM tools that are sort of adding the traditional CRM tools, adding on bolt-ons, which are social media. So a lot of email platforms I saw as well. And so there's all these people fighting for a market which is still 80% dominated by the free tools. And so I think that it's going to be a big fight, and one that we want to be part of. I think there are a lot more companies that are interested in customer service than there are that are interested in research, or rather there's a lot more money in customer research, customer service, and providing people to publish content and answer questions and that than there is in just research and monitoring. So I think we have to move there, and I think our competitors will move there. I don't know if there'll be one technology that wins, but there's, you know, at the starting line, which is where we pretty much are, because people are still using free tools, there's an awful lot of good-looking starters. So I'm not sure who will win the race, but there's plenty of us on the starting line.
Interesting. Well, when you say these three tools, that data comes from everyone who uses Twitter, but they could be private persons as well, not necessarily enterprises.
I was looking at the responses from the corporations. So I was looking at 160 corporate accounts responding to individuals. And those were still being used in the free accounts. So the corporations that I looked at in my sample were using the free tools generally, mostly the web. So, you know, big companies responding to tweets on Twitter.
When I see this, what I have on my wish list is sort of like a tool that have your social inbox. I envision that to be, for example, a couple of streams or a dashboard where everything that is sent to me on the social web comes up. Maybe it could be a comment on my blog, it could be comments on my YouTube videos, tweets. And then I have another part which is outside my proprietary channels, which is things that have been mentioned, which today the social media monitoring tools does. Because when I have this in the same tool, then I also can attach an ID to these people and potentially a customer ID or things like that. Do you see this is where it's going, or how do you see it?
Yes, I think that's going to be the migration. I think that's the race we're on, to be able to merge both what's happening in the broader world and what's happening directly, you know, on channels that affect you. So I mean that's basically when I describe this race for all these different types of tools to produce all these different types of companies to produce a final tool that works for everyone.
Yeah,
I think that's what it'll be.
Yeah. Another thing, how you can use this data. I saw that recently you sponsored Tweet Camp in London, and I noted that you had a very interesting campaign site which was powered by yourself and using the monitoring data. Tell us a bit more about how you can use monitoring data in your marketing campaigns.
Yeah, so we get involved with Tweet Camp as sort of sponsors more than the original idea generators. But the idea was that the people who tweet Camp most would get a stall at this Tweet Camp, this kind of conference, and that would be the only criteria for how you manage to get a pitch to be able to talk to people. And so it was sort of a very organic and almost sort of hippie-like way of organising a conference. And so we could use our data to decide who it was who had been talking about Tweet Camp the most, and we just fed into a relatively simple I guess infographic that would just allocate the camps, and so that's how it worked. I think it was a charming exercise, and the people at the Tweet Camp described the event as a huge success, and and the people there were using Twitter in very innovative and great ways. So it was sort of a triumph of us using monitoring data to achieve the company's goals, and it was very much tied to, the more you kind of talk about this event, the more likely you are to be a big part of it. So that's how that worked. People do use monitoring data for all sorts of things at the moment. I mean, we're doing a project at the moment with a big video games company to track how well you can predict sales of video games based on the volumes of social media mentions before launch, and tracking that from the first announcement, through to the first demo, or the first video footage, to the first demo, to the first, few releases. And there's lots of other bits and pieces which people are using the actual numbers to kind of drive either events or decisions or what have you. So we are seeing lots of interesting things with social media data.
Excellent. Brian, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having you on this webcast about social media monitoring and social CRM. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.